Some secrets are hidden in books, but the most dangerous ones are written into blood. Emily Parker had heard countless stories about destiny while growing up, but she never believed any of them were meant for her. She was an Omega, a quiet young woman who spent most of her days working inside the royal palace, far from the grand halls where nobles discussed history and power. Every morning before sunrise, she crossed the marble courtyards carrying linens, records, or supplies wherever they were needed. Most people barely noticed her. Others noticed her only long enough to give instructions. Emily never complained. Life had taught her that kindness and patience often mattered more than recognition. The palace stood above the capital like a monument to centuries of power. Towering stone walls reflected the morning light. Elegant gardens stretched across acres of carefully maintained grounds. Visitors traveled hundreds of miles to admire its beauty. Yet for Emily, the palace was simply where she worked. She knew which corridors remained quiet during the afternoon. She knew where the sunlight fell through stained glass windows. She knew the hidden corners where she could enjoy a few peaceful moments when her duties allowed. What nobody knew was that Emily carried a secret she had hidden her entire life. On the back of her left shoulder rested a birthmark unlike any ordinary mark. Its shape resembled a silver crescent moon surrounded by delicate lines that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Her grandmother had always insisted she keep it covered whenever possible. As a child, Emily often asked why. The older woman never offered a complete answer. She simply smiled sadly and said, "Some things are safer when they remain unseen." Over the years, Emily stopped asking questions. The mark became just another part of her life. That morning began like countless others. Emily spent several hours organizing documents inside one of the palace administration offices. Later, she delivered records to various departments scattered throughout the royal grounds. By early afternoon, warm sunlight filled the hallways. She carried a stack of ledgers toward the royal archives, a place she always enjoyed visiting. The archives were quieter than the rest of the palace. The scent of old books filled the air. Ancient knowledge rested upon endless shelves stretching toward high ceilings. As Emily entered one of the reading rooms, she noticed Professor Henry Whitmore working alone at a large table. The elderly scholar was one of the kingdom's most respected historians. He had spent decades studying royal genealogy, forgotten dynasties, and lost records. Most people found him intimidating. Emily found him kind. She greeted him politely and began placing documents onto a nearby shelf. A few moments later, one of the folders slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor. Emily immediately knelt to gather them. As she reached forward, the sleeve of her dress shifted slightly. For only a second, the fabric moved enough to reveal part of the crescent-shaped birthmark near her shoulder. The moment should have meant nothing. Yet across the room, Professor Whitmore suddenly froze. The pen slipped from his fingers. His eyes widened. Every trace of color seemed to drain from his face. Emily remained focused on collecting the papers and noticed nothing unusual. But Whitmore could not look away. For years he had searched through ancient records, royal portraits, and forgotten manuscripts. And now, standing only a few feet away, he was staring at a symbol he had not seen outside historical documents in more than 20 years. The realization struck him with overwhelming force. The mark on Emily's shoulder was not merely a birthmark. It was the exact symbol connected to one of the greatest royal mysteries in the kingdom's history. And at that moment, without realizing it, Emily Parker had just awakened a secret that powerful people had spent decades trying to bury. Professor Henry Whitmore remained seated long after Emily left the reading room. The scattered papers had been collected. The shelves stood exactly as they had before. Nothing appeared different. Yet for the elderly scholar, everything had changed. His eyes remained fixed on the doorway through which Emily had disappeared. For years he had studied forgotten dynasties and lost bloodlines. Entire sections of his life had been devoted to mysteries that most people considered impossible to solve. But nothing in all those years had prepared him for what he had just seen. Slowly, Whitmore reached into a leather satchel beside his chair and removed a small notebook. Its pages contained sketches copied from ancient manuscripts and royal records. With careful hands, he turned through the worn pages until he reached a drawing he had made nearly a decade earlier. The symbol stared back at him, a crescent moon surrounded by delicate silver markings. His heart sank. It was identical. Meanwhile, Emily continued her duties without the slightest awareness of the storm beginning to gather around her. She spent the remainder of the afternoon delivering records, organizing correspondence, and assisting various palace departments. The routine comforted her. Work had always been simple, predictable, unlike the questions that occasionally surfaced whenever she thought about her past. Those questions had become more frequent since arriving at the palace. Sometimes she caught herself staring at old portraits or listening too carefully whenever historians discussed events from long ago. Certain stories felt strangely familiar. Certain places stirred emotions she could not explain. Yet every time she tried to understand those feelings, the answers slipped away. As evening approached, she carried a stack of documents toward one of the palace gardens. The path wound between flowering hedges and stone fountains. The setting sun painted everything in warm shades of gold. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to enjoy the peaceful view. Nearby, several nobles crossed the garden discussing political matters. None paid attention to her. She preferred it that way. Across the palace grounds, Whitmore hurried through the royal archives with a sense of urgency unusual for a man his age. He entered a restricted research room and immediately began searching through old storage cabinets. Dust rose into the air as forgotten boxes were opened one after another. Scrolls, family records, and ancient inventories covered the large table before him. Hours passed. Lanterns replaced sunlight. Still he searched. Finally, shortly before midnight, he found what he had been looking for. Hidden inside a collection of genealogical records was a faded illustration copied from an even older royal manuscript. Whitmore carefully placed the page beneath the light. His breath caught. There was no doubt. The image depicted the exact symbol he had seen on Emily's shoulder. Beneath the illustration appeared a brief note written centuries earlier. The silver moon mark, reserved for the direct heirs of the House of Linares. Whitmore stared at the words. House Linares. The name had nearly vanished from modern history. Official records described the family as extinct. Yet the scholar knew the truth was far more complicated. Decades earlier, mysterious gaps had begun appearing in historical documents related to the dynasty. Entire records had disappeared. References had been altered. Certain names seemed intentionally erased. The deeper he investigated, the stranger the pattern became. By dawn, Whitmore had filled several pages with notes. One conclusion continued appearing no matter how he arranged the evidence. The mark on Emily's shoulder was not random. It was not decorative. It was not ordinary. It was a royal identifier known only to a handful of historians. As the first morning light entered the archives, Whitmore closed the final book and looked toward the palace rising beyond the windows. Somewhere inside those walls, Emily Parker was beginning another ordinary day. She still believed she was simply an Omega working quietly among people who rarely noticed her. But Whitmore now understood something that made sleep impossible. The symbol she had hidden her entire life belonged to a bloodline that the kingdom had spent more than 20 years trying to forget. The days that followed felt ordinary to Emily, yet subtle changes began appearing around her. At first they were so small that she barely noticed them. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. Archivists who had never spoken to her before suddenly greeted her politely. Palace staff seemed to watch her for a moment longer than usual. None of it made sense. She assumed she was imagining things. After all, nothing about her life had changed. She was still the same Omega who spent her mornings organizing records and her afternoons assisting wherever help was needed. Yet while Emily continued her routine, Professor Henry Whitmore's investigation deepened. Every document he uncovered led to new questions. Entire sections of royal history appeared incomplete. Records referenced events that no longer existed in official archives. Names appeared in one manuscript and vanished from another. It was as though someone had carefully removed pieces of a much larger story. One afternoon, Whitmore sat surrounded by stacks of books inside a private research chamber. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating pages spread across a massive table. He compared dates, family trees, and historical accounts. Again and again, the same conclusion emerged. House Linares had not simply disappeared. Evidence suggested its history had been deliberately buried. The realization troubled him. Historical mistakes happened. Lost records happened. But this felt different. This felt intentional. Meanwhile, Emily found herself increasingly drawn toward the royal archives during her free moments. The quiet rooms had become a refuge. She enjoyed the scent of old paper and the peaceful silence between towering shelves. One evening, after completing her duties, she wandered through a gallery displaying historical portraits. Most visitors ignored the room entirely. Emily often stopped there because she liked studying the paintings. As she moved slowly past generations of nobles and rulers, one portrait caught her attention. It depicted a young royal woman standing beneath a silver moon banner. Emily froze. A strange sensation washed over her. The woman looked nothing like her. Different hair, different clothing. Yet something about the expression felt familiar. She stepped closer. Beneath the painting was a faded plaque. Much of the text had become difficult to read over time. Only one line remained clear. Lady Eleanor of House Linares. Emily stared at the name. House Linares. She had heard it before. Her mind searched for the memory. Then she remembered. Several days earlier, she had overheard two historians discussing lost dynasties. One of them had mentioned the name in passing. At the time, it had seemed unimportant. Now she could not stop thinking about it. Across the palace grounds, another development was quietly unfolding. Alpha King Nathan Wolfe had begun receiving unusual reports from various departments. Several referenced Whitmore's growing research activity. Others mentioned requests for restricted documents. Nathan was not a man who ignored patterns. For years he had governed the kingdom by paying attention to details others overlooked. The repeated references eventually captured his interest. Late that evening, he reviewed a summary of recent archive requests while seated in his private study. Most appeared harmless. Historical reviews, genealogical records, ancient inventories. Yet one detail stood out. Nearly every request involved House Linares. Nathan leaned back in his chair. The name was familiar, though not from any recent political matter. It belonged to a chapter of history rarely discussed. Curious, he reached for a book detailing the kingdom's royal lineages. Several minutes later, his brow furrowed. The information felt incomplete. Entire periods seemed strangely vague. Questions began forming in his mind. At that exact moment, miles of forgotten history connected three people who had no idea how deeply their paths were about to intertwine. Emily searched for answers she did not know she needed. Whitmore chased a truth hidden beneath decades of silence. And Nathan Wolfe was beginning to suspect that the kingdom's official history was hiding something far greater than anyone had imagined. The questions surrounding House Linares refused to leave Emily's mind. Over the next several days, she found herself noticing details she would have ignored before. Names appearing in old records, symbols carved into palace architecture, fragments of history hidden in paintings and tapestries. It was as though an invisible thread had begun weaving through her ordinary life, quietly connecting pieces she had never thought belonged together. Yet despite her growing curiosity, she still believed the answers existed somewhere far beyond her reach. One rainy afternoon, while delivering documents to the royal archives, Emily noticed unusual activity in one of the restricted research wings. Archivists moved stacks of boxes from a storage room that had remained locked for years. Dust-covered ledgers and sealed containers lined the hallway. The sight immediately caught her attention. Restricted collections were rarely disturbed. As she passed, she overheard fragments of conversation. These records have not been opened in decades. The seals are still intact. Professor Whitmore requested everything connected to the old dynasties. Emily slowed her pace but continued walking. She knew better than to interfere. Even so, the words lingered in her thoughts. Inside the restricted section, Whitmore stood before a long table covered with newly recovered materials. The contents were unlike anything he had expected. Several boxes contained administrative records. Others held correspondence between royal officials. Most appeared ordinary at first glance. Yet buried among them were files that should not have existed. Entire sections of history that had vanished from public archives had somehow survived inside forgotten storage rooms. Hour after hour, Whitmore examined the documents. Some confirmed facts he already suspected. Others raised even more questions. Then, near sunset, he discovered something remarkable. Hidden inside a collection of royal inventories was a sealed ledger bearing the insignia of House Linares. His pulse quickened. The seal remained unbroken. With extraordinary care, he opened the book. The pages inside contained references to family estates, ceremonial traditions, and succession records. Most importantly, they included details that had never appeared in any modern historical account. Whitmore read in silence. The deeper he went, the more troubled he became. House Linares had not faded naturally from history. Evidence suggested that entire generations of records had been intentionally removed. Meanwhile, Alpha King Nathan Wolfe continued reviewing the growing reports from the archives. His curiosity had evolved into concern. Too many inconsistencies appeared whenever House Linares was mentioned. That evening, he requested a private meeting with Whitmore. The two men sat inside a quiet study overlooking the palace gardens. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Whitmore explained his findings. Nathan listened without interruption. When the historian finished, silence filled the room. "You are suggesting that parts of our official history are incomplete," Nathan said carefully. Whitmore nodded. "Incomplete at best." Nathan looked toward the darkened gardens beyond the glass. "And this somehow connects to the Omega working in the palace?" Whitmore hesitated. "I believe so." The king remained thoughtful. He trusted Whitmore's judgment, yet the implications were enormous. If the scholar was correct, they were not simply investigating a forgotten family. They were uncovering a secret that had survived for more than 2 decades. The following morning, Emily arrived at work to find several employees studying her when they thought she was not looking. The attention made her uncomfortable. She focused on her duties and avoided unnecessary conversations. Yet as the day continued, she sensed that something was changing, not in the palace itself, in the people around her. It was as though an invisible question followed her through every hallway. Late that afternoon, while organizing records near one of the archive reading rooms, Emily noticed Whitmore staring at an old family tree displayed beneath protective glass. He seemed completely absorbed in thought. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke, yet something in the scholar's expression unsettled her. It was not fear. It was certainty. And at that moment, Whitmore had already discovered another piece of the puzzle. Hidden within the newly opened ledger was a reference to a child born with the silver moon mark shortly before House Linares disappeared from history. According to the record, the child had vanished the same year the dynasty itself was erased from official memory. Professor Whitmore barely slept after discovering the reference to the missing child. The ledger remained open on his desk long after midnight, illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. He had read the passage countless times, hoping to find some flaw in his reasoning. None appeared. Every detail pointed in the same direction. The silver moon mark. The disappearance of House Linares. A child lost during the same year the dynasty vanished from official history. Separately, the facts seemed intriguing. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Yet Whitmore understood that suspicion was not proof. He needed evidence strong enough to survive public scrutiny. The following morning, Alpha King Nathan Wolfe arrived at the Royal Archives before most of the staff. He had spent the previous evening reviewing historical summaries related to House Linares. The more he studied them, the more unsettled he became. Entire decades appeared strangely incomplete. Official explanations felt vague. Important events lacked supporting documentation. For a kingdom known for preserving its records, the absence of information was impossible to overlook. Nathan found Whitmore already working inside the restricted research wing. Books and ledgers covered every available surface. The scholar looked exhausted, but his eyes carried an unusual intensity. "You found something else," Nathan said. It was not a question. Whitmore nodded. Without speaking, he handed over a copied page from the recovered ledger. Nathan read carefully. As his eyes moved across the text, his expression gradually changed. The record described a direct descendant of House Linares born with a unique identifying mark. The child had been removed from public records during a period of political uncertainty. No further information followed. The remaining pages had either been lost or intentionally removed. Nathan lowered the document. "And you believe Emily is connected to this?" Whitmore answered carefully. "I believe the similarities are too significant to dismiss." Nathan remained silent for several moments. Through the window behind the scholar, he could see the palace grounds beginning to fill with activity. Staff crossed courtyards. Messengers moved between buildings. Somewhere among them, Emily was likely beginning another ordinary day, completely unaware of the questions surrounding her existence. "What do you need?" Nathan finally asked. Whitmore looked surprised. Your support. The king nodded. You have it. Meanwhile, Emily spent the morning assisting in one of the palace record offices. Yet even routine tasks felt different now. She could not explain why. The strange attention from others continued. More than once she caught people looking away when she noticed them watching. A few conversations stopped abruptly as she approached. None of it felt hostile. If anything, people seemed uncertain. The uncertainty bothered her more than open dislike ever could. During lunch, she retreated to a quiet section of the palace gardens. The area overlooked a small lake surrounded by flowering trees. It had become one of her favorite places. She sat alone on a stone bench and watched sunlight shimmer across the water. For the first time in days, the noise inside her mind began to settle. Then she noticed someone approaching along the garden path. It was Nathan Wolfe. Emily immediately stood and lowered her gaze respectfully. Encounters with the king were rare for most palace workers. Nathan offered a polite nod. Please, do not let me interrupt your break. Emily relaxed slightly. The conversation that followed lasted only a few minutes. Nathan asked simple questions about her work, her interests, and how long she had served in the palace. Nothing seemed unusual, yet Emily sensed that he was observing more than her answers. He listened carefully, as though searching for something hidden beneath ordinary words. When the conversation ended, Nathan walked away with even more questions than before. Emily remained by the lake, puzzled by the encounter. Across the palace grounds, Whitmore continued his investigation. Late that afternoon, another breakthrough emerged from the restricted archives. Hidden within a collection of forgotten correspondence was a sealed letter written shortly before House Linares disappeared. The final sentence sent a chill through him. If the child survives, the silver moon mark will reveal the truth when the time is right. For the first time since the investigation began, Whitmore no longer wondered whether Emily was connected to the mystery. He was beginning to wonder how much of the kingdom's future depended on her. The sealed letter remained in Professor Whitmore's hands long after he finished reading it. Outside the archive windows, twilight slowly settled across the capital. Lamps flickered to life throughout the palace grounds, casting warm pools of light across stone pathways and quiet courtyards. Yet Whitmore barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on a single sentence written more than 20 years earlier. If the child survives, the silver moon mark will reveal the truth when the time is right. For days he had followed fragments of evidence. Now, for the first time, those fragments seemed to be forming a complete picture. The following morning, Whitmore requested a private audience with Alpha King Nathan Wolfe. They met inside a secure chamber adjacent to the royal archives. Several boxes of recovered records stood nearby. The scholar carefully presented everything he had discovered: family ledgers, historical references, the sealed letter, missing succession records. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion. Nathan listened without interruption. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room. The king walked slowly toward one of the windows overlooking the city. Thousands of people moved through their daily lives below. None of them knew that a forgotten chapter of the kingdom's history might soon return. If your interpretation is correct, Nathan finally said, then this is no longer a historical curiosity. Whitmore nodded. No, Your Majesty. It is a matter of truth. Nathan remained thoughtful. He understood the responsibility attached to such a revelation. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. Before any public action could occur, every detail needed verification. Fortunately, another opportunity had just appeared. Earlier that week, archivists had discovered several sealed containers hidden behind a collapsed storage wall in the oldest section of the archives. The containers had not yet been examined. Now they suddenly became their highest priority. By midday, a small team of specialists carefully opened the recovered collection. Emily knew nothing about the discovery. She spent her morning organizing records and assisting visitors as usual. Yet she could not shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding around her. More than once she noticed senior staff moving quickly between departments. Several archivists appeared unusually excited. Even Professor Whitmore seemed distracted whenever their paths crossed. The atmosphere throughout the palace felt charged with anticipation. Deep inside the restricted archive wing, the newly opened containers revealed documents untouched for decades. Most contained administrative records. Some held correspondence between nobles. Then one archivist uncovered a leather-bound registry preserved in remarkable condition. Whitmore immediately recognized its significance. It was an official succession register, the very type of record believed lost during the disappearance of House Linares. Carefully, the team began reviewing its contents. Hours passed. Names, dates, and family connections filled the pages. Then, near the end of the volume, Whitmore found an entry that caused his hands to tremble. The document referenced the birth of a female heir born during the final year before House Linares vanished from public history. Next to the entry appeared a notation unlike any other. Distinguishing feature, silver moon mark. The room fell silent. Every person present understood the importance of what they were seeing. The description matched perfectly, not partially, not approximately, perfectly. Later that evening, Nathan reviewed the newly recovered registry himself. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Yet one question remained unanswered. Where had the child gone after the disappearance of House Linares? The answer arrived unexpectedly. Hidden among several attached pages was a transportation record documenting the transfer of an infant to the care of a trusted guardian living far from the capital. A handwritten note identified the guardian only by surname. Parker. Nathan lowered the document slowly. Emily Parker. The connection was undeniable. Across the palace grounds, Emily stood alone on a balcony overlooking the city lights. She had come there seeking a few moments of peace after another confusing day. A cool evening breeze moved through her hair as she watched the streets below. She still believed her life was ordinary. She still believed the unanswered questions belonged to someone else. But inside the archives, the final barriers protecting the truth were beginning to fall. And for the first time in more than 20 years, the kingdom possessed enough evidence to prove that the lost heir of House Linares had never truly disappeared. The discovery of the transportation record changed everything. Until now, Professor Whitmore and Alpha King Nathan Wolfe had been following clues, assembling fragments of a forgotten story piece by piece. But the registry connecting the lost heir of House Linares to the Parker family transformed suspicion into evidence. For the first time, they were no longer asking whether Emily was connected to the mystery. They were asking how to reveal the truth responsibly. The answer required one final step. Every recovered document, ledger, letter, and registry would need to be reviewed before an official hearing could take place. During the days that followed, the royal archives became the center of intense activity. Historians, genealogists, and legal scholars examined the recovered records. Each expert worked independently. Each reached the same conclusion. The silver moon mark had belonged exclusively to the direct heirs of House Linares. The transportation record connected the final known heir to the Parker family. The timelines matched perfectly. Even the ages aligned. Piece after piece reinforced the same extraordinary reality. Meanwhile, Emily struggled to understand why her world felt increasingly unfamiliar. People treated her differently now. Not openly, not dramatically, but subtle changes appeared everywhere. Palace staff greeted her with unusual warmth. Archivists who had once barely noticed her suddenly asked for her opinions. More than once she caught senior officials watching her with expressions she could not interpret. The attention left her unsettled. She longed for the simplicity her life had possessed only a few weeks earlier. One afternoon, while organizing records near the central reading hall, Emily noticed Professor Whitmore approaching. His expression carried a seriousness she had never seen before. "Emily," he said gently, "there is something important we need to discuss soon." The words immediately tightened her chest. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Whitmore hesitated. "No, quite the opposite." Before she could ask another question, he offered a reassuring smile and continued down the corridor. Emily remained standing among the shelves, more confused than ever. Across the palace, preparations quietly began for a formal historical review before the royal council. Nathan understood the significance of what was about to happen. The truth would not simply affect Emily. It would affect the kingdom's understanding of its own history. Every detail needed transparency. Every conclusion needed proof. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. News of the gathering spread quickly among nobles and government officials. Rumors followed. Some believed a major historical discovery had been made. Others suspected a forgotten succession dispute. Few guessed the truth. On the morning of the hearing, sunlight poured through the towering windows of the Grand Council Hall. Representatives from across the kingdom filled the chamber. Historians occupied entire rows of seats. Advisors, nobles, and legal scholars waited quietly. The atmosphere felt tense but respectful. Emily stood near the entrance, uncertain why she had been invited to attend. She wore her usual formal attire and had spent the entire morning trying to calm her nerves. Nothing about the situation felt normal. Then she noticed Nathan standing near the council platform. Their eyes briefly met. Instead of concern, she saw reassurance. The gesture helped more than he realized. Moments later, Professor Whitmore stepped forward carrying several bound volumes. The room gradually fell silent. Every conversation faded. Every eye turned toward the historian. He placed the recovered records on the presentation table and took a slow breath. Years of research had led to this moment. Decades of hidden history were about to return to the light. Emily sat quietly among the audience, completely unaware that the next hour would change her life forever. As Whitmore opened the first ledger and began presenting the evidence, the chamber listened carefully. The story of House Linares unfolded piece by piece. Lost records, hidden documents, missing heirs. The mystery that had survived for more than 20 years was finally approaching its conclusion. And as the first references to the silver moon mark echoed through the hall, a realization began spreading across the faces of those present. The truth they were uncovering was not buried in the distant past. It was sitting among them. The silence inside the Grand Council Hall grew heavier with every document Professor Whitmore presented. One by one, the pieces of the forgotten story emerged from decades of darkness. The recovered ledgers confirmed the existence of House Linares. The succession records established the line of inheritance. The transportation registry connected the missing heir to the Parker family. Each revelation strengthened the next. No one interrupted. No one challenged the evidence. The records spoke for themselves. Emily sat motionless among the audience, her heart beating faster with every passing minute. She listened carefully, trying to understand how a discussion about lost dynasties and forgotten heirs had somehow become connected to her. Around the chamber, nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Historians reviewed their notes repeatedly. Even those who had arrived skeptical now struggled to deny what the evidence revealed. Then Whitmore reached the final stage of his presentation. He carefully opened the restored succession registry and displayed the page containing the description of the missing child. Every eye in the room focused on the document. The words appeared simple. Female heir. House Linares. Distinguishing feature. Silver moon mark. The historian allowed several moments of silence before speaking again. For many years, he said, this identifying mark was believed lost along with the bloodline itself. His voice remained calm, but carried throughout the hall. However, the evidence demonstrates that the mark survived. Emily felt a chill run through her body. Instinctively, her hand moved toward her left shoulder. Across the room, several people noticed the gesture. Nathan watched quietly from the council platform. He knew what was coming next. Whitmore slowly turned toward Emily. The entire chamber followed his gaze. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Emily stared back at him, confused and overwhelmed. Then the historian spoke the words that changed everything. The surviving heir of House Linares is Emily Parker. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Conversations erupted before quickly being silenced. Several nobles stared in disbelief. Others looked toward Emily with shock written across their faces. Yet despite the emotion filling the chamber, Whitmore continued presenting the evidence. He explained the significance of the silver moon mark. He detailed the transportation records connecting Emily to the Parker family. He reviewed the timelines, the surviving correspondence, and the succession registry. Every conclusion pointed toward the same truth. Emily listened as though hearing someone else's story. Memories of her grandmother flooded her thoughts. The warnings, the secrecy, the sadness hidden behind certain conversations. Suddenly, details that had never made sense began falling into place. Tears gathered in her eyes. Not from fear, from understanding. Across the hall, Nathan rose from his seat. His movement immediately drew attention. The room became silent once more. The Alpha King stepped forward and addressed the assembly. The evidence has been independently verified, he said. The findings are supported by the archives, the historians, and the legal scholars assigned to this review. His voice carried authority, but also something else, Respect. Nathan looked directly at Emily. The truth does not change who she is. The statement surprised many people. He continued. She earned the respect of this palace long before any of us understood her history. Her character was never dependent upon a title. The words affected Emily more deeply than she expected. For the first time since the hearing began, she felt steady again. Around the chamber, attitudes began shifting. People were no longer looking at her with suspicion. They were looking at her with recognition. An elderly noblewoman slowly stood and lowered her head respectfully. Others followed. One after another, members of the council acknowledged the truth that had finally emerged. The forgotten bloodline had survived. The lost heir had been found. And as sunlight poured through the towering windows of the Grand Council Hall, illuminating decades of recovered history spread across the tables, Emily realized that the mystery surrounding her birth was over. But the future that awaited her was only beginning. The days following the council hearing felt almost unreal to Emily. Everywhere she went, people greeted her differently. The change was not rooted in fear or obligation. It came from understanding. For the first time, the truth about House Linares existed openly instead of hidden within forgotten records. Historians worked tirelessly to restore missing sections of the kingdom's history. Official archives were updated. Family registries were corrected. The name that had nearly vanished from memory was finally returning to its rightful place. Yet despite everything happening around her, Emily remained the same person she had always been. She still spent time in the archives. She still preferred quiet conversations over public attention. She still found comfort among books rather than ceremonies. The only difference was that she finally understood the questions that had followed her throughout her life. 1 week after the hearing, a formal gathering was held inside the Grand Hall. Representatives from every major region of the kingdom attended. Nobles, scholars, council members, and community leaders filled the chamber. Banners displaying the restored symbol of House Linares hung beside the kingdom's standard. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the room in warm golden light. Emily stood near the front of the hall wearing a simple but elegant gown. She had never felt comfortable being the center of attention, but she understood why this moment mattered. The event was not only about her. It was about truth. It was about restoring a missing piece of the kingdom's history. Professor Whitmore stepped forward first. His voice carried clearly throughout the chamber as he summarized the investigation that had brought them all together. He spoke about the recovered records, the hidden correspondence, the transportation registry, and the generations of lost history. When he finished, the audience rose in applause. The elderly scholar smiled modestly and stepped aside. Then Alpha King, Nathan Wolfe, approached the center platform. The hall immediately became silent. He looked across the gathered crowd before turning toward Emily. History has finally been allowed to speak for itself, he said. What was hidden has been restored. What was forgotten has been remembered. His words resonated throughout the chamber. Nathan paused before continuing. But today is not simply about recovering a lost bloodline. It is about recognizing the person who carried that history without ever knowing it. Emily felt emotion rise within her. Nathan's gaze remained steady. Long before anyone knew her connection to House Linares, she earned the respect of those around her through kindness, humility, and integrity. Those qualities are not inherited. They are chosen. The hall filled with quiet agreement. Many people nodded. Some smiled warmly toward Emily. For the first time, she realized they were not honoring a title. They were honoring the person she had always tried to be. After the ceremony concluded, guests gradually departed. The palace slowly returned to its usual rhythm. As evening approached, Emily found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the capital. The city stretched across the horizon beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and violet. Beside her stood Nathan. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence felt peaceful. Finally, Emily smiled softly. My grandmother used to tell me that every question has an answer, even if it takes years to find it. Nathan looked toward the city lights beginning to appear below. She was wise. Emily nodded. I think she knew more than she ever told me. The breeze carried the scent of flowering gardens across the balcony. For the first time in her life, she felt complete. The uncertainty that had followed her since childhood was gone. She knew where she came from. She understood why her grandmother had protected her. Most importantly, she understood that her worth had never depended on a title or a bloodline. The silver moon mark had revealed the truth, but it had not created the person she had become. As darkness settled gently over the kingdom, the restored records of House Linares rested safely within the royal archives. The mystery was over. The secret had been revealed. And far above the city, beneath the first stars of the evening sky, Emily Parker finally felt what she had been searching for all along. She had found her place in the story.